Yeah, I'm here. We're ready. All right, we're going to be in Leviticus 22, hopefully 23, maybe 16. We'll see. So Leviticus 22. Last time we finished off the discussion of Nadab and Abihu, which was that culmination of the consecration of the priests, that God had taken Aaron and his sons. Moses then consecrated Aaron and his sons, Aaron and his sons, without Moses, start offering sacrifices, and then two of his sons break the covenant with him and are killed as a result. So, that led us into 21 and 22. We did 21 last time with chapter 10. And it's about holiness. It's about how are the priests to behave, how are they to be, how is their life supposed to be. We even got into what kind of man is allowed to be priest. So just some of the things that we talked about. A priest is not allowed to mourn in the same way that others are allowed to mourn. A priest is required to marry a certain kind of woman. High priests are... Oh, hi. I didn't see you come in. Anyways, high priests are required to marry a certain kind of woman. High priests are even more strictly given orders when it comes to unclean things. And then 16 down through 24, generally to priests, you cannot be a priest if you have any kind of permanent blemish. Any of them. If you were on the fast track to be high priest, but you were a really klutzy teenager and got yourself really injured, nope. Now you're just a priest, and you're not even allowed to do anything. So think about it that way. Yes, you are of Aaron's family. Yes, they're probably even going to call you priest, but you're certainly not offering sacrifices. You're not working at the tabernacle, even though you're allowed to eat of the holy things. You are on the outside. And we talked about reasoning behind that. The priesthood is God's perfection. It is God's righteousness. It is God's holiness on earth. They can have no wrongness to them. None whatsoever. They are the only ones on earth that are responsible to be the in-betweens, the go-betweens, the mediators between God's chosen people and God. If that gets messed up, there's nothing. So, chapter 22. 22, we're going to continue talking about holiness, continue to talk about what does a priest need to do. So let's go ahead and start reading off. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and his sons, so that they may abstain from the holy things of the people of Israel, which they dedicate to me, so that they do not profane my holy name. I am the Lord." So that's the overarching, what we're talking about here. We're talking about how to not profane the name. How do we not go against God's name and then cause blasphemy or cause unrighteousness or cause sin within the camp? So they're to stay away from holy things under certain situations. Verse 3, "Say to them, if any one of your offspring throughout your generations approaches the holy things that the people of Israel dedicate to the Lord while he has an uncleanness, that person shall be cut off from my presence. I am the Lord." And he goes on to describe an uncleanness. The difference between this passage from verse 1 down through verse 9 and the passage of 16 down through verse 24 is that this passage is about temporary things, where the previous one was primarily about permanent things. You don't have a hand anymore. That's it. Like, there's no more, right? But this one is about leprosy. This one is about if you have a discharge. This one is about if you touch a dead individual. If you have an emission of semen. Down there, if you touch a swarming thing in verse 5, you are now unclean. And unclean tended to be, verse 6, "The person who touches such a thing shall be unclean until evening, shall not eat of the holy things unless he has bathed his body in water. When the sun goes down, he becomes clean. Afterwards he may eat of the holy things because they are his food. He shall not eat what dies of itself or is torn by beasts, and so make himself unclean by it. I am the Lord. They shall therefore keep my charge, lest they bear sin for it and die thereby when they profane it. I am the Lord who sanctifies them." So, uncleanness is not nearly as much of a problem as permanent maimeness. And that's the big difference here. Permanently, you can't be a priest. This one, you're only unclean till evening, which means you get a day off because you can't go near the holy things. But it's not like we think of a day off, like it's a shame-filled thing. Like you're not where you're supposed to be. And every single person in the entire camp of Israel knows you're not where you're supposed to be because you're at home because you're unclean. probably because you did something you weren't supposed to, or something awful is happening in your life. Any comments on that section before we go further? Yeah. And we see why the Pharisees go the way they do. Their ritual cleansings every single day are bordering on excessive because of that concern. I don't want to accidentally be unclean. Remember, we went through the sin offering and the unintentional sins, and then intentional sins, and so forth and so on. Well, they don't want to have that problem. They don't want to have that difficulty. And so, yeah, they go way into the excess, and Jesus yells at them all the time about it because they miss the weightier things and think that this is the most important. Any other thoughts? Good comment. Cool. Verse 10. What do you do with the food that is holy? That's what verse 10 down through verse 16 or so is trying to answer. Because if you remember, some of the foods you're allowed to take home for your family. Some of them you're not. Grain offerings have to be eaten a certain way. Sin offerings are a certain way. Guilt offerings and peace offerings and so forth. They all have their own little regulations, but some of them let you bring it home and anybody can eat. What does anybody mean? Remember, this is law of Moses. We're going to quantify it. We're going to be very specific here. So in verse 10, he says, a lay person shall not eat a holy thing. Normal Jew? No. No foreign guest of the priest or hired worker shall eat of a holy thing. But if a priest buys a slave as his property for money, the slave may eat of it. Anyone born in his house may eat of his food. So notice the principle being established here. If you bring in an outsider to do work for you, so a foreigner, a hired person, they are not of your family. They may live with you. They may be someone who lives on your property. They may eat of your table when it isn't of holy things. They might. But if it's a holy thing, they're not of your family. A slave, on the other hand, is. You have purchased them and brought them into your home. They're of you now. Which is an interesting perspective, isn't it? Because is that not similar terminology to what we have in the New Testament, that we were bought with a price? And we don't think of ourselves as outside of the family, do we? Just because we were bought to be slaves of righteousness. No, we think of ourselves as being in the family because that is the Jewish perspective. Anyone born in the house may eat of his food as well, because you are of the family. You are of the priest's family. One interesting point here that I want to make now, because it's going to be a big deal later, is the word foreign. Some of yours may use a variety of translations there. Some might say stranger. ESV says foreign guest, because it's trying to distinguish from the other word foreign that is used in verse 25. When it talks about a foreigner over there, it says, neither shall you offer as the bread of your God any such animal as gotten from a foreigner. When it says it in verse 10, it means a foreign person living among you. So you know who he is, but he's not an Israelite. That's the point. When it says it over there in verse 25, it means a foreign person that does not live amongst you, which means you don't have a clue who he is. Just a bunch of cows showed up one day, and you bought one. Where do they come from? What is their family lineage? You have no idea. And so that's the point he's making. You can buy it for yourself. Sure, buy and trade with the nations. But you cannot use it as something given to God. Bread of your God is the way verse 25 words it. So I just want to make that distinction because that word is used in both times. And some of yours may just say stranger each time. Any thoughts on that before I go further in this passage? For some of the words that we're going to read here in just a moment, a proselyte cannot go into Levi, for one. So they can't eat of a holy thing in and of itself. Like, they don't even get the chance to go into there. I'm actually not really sure what they do with proselytes as far as do they go into certain tribes, or are they always the 13th tribe? Like, because they're never talked about. In all the Old Testament, we really never see them going out and proselytizing. We only see it in the New Testament. When Jesus says you do an awful job and you make him twice the son of the devil. But yeah, that's a good comment. I don't have an answer, but it's a good comment. All right, let's finish off this section. In verse 12, if a priest's daughter marries a layman, she shall not eat of the contribution to the holy things. Why? She's not your family anymore. She's gone to a different family. However, if she becomes widowed or divorced, notice divorced is allowed here, isn't that fun? And has no child and returns to her father's house, as in her youth she may eat of her father's food, yet no layperson shall eat of it. If anyone eats of a holy thing unintentionally, he shall add a fifth of its value to it and give the holy thing to the priest. They shall not profane the holy things of the people of Israel, which they contribute to the Lord, and so cause them to bear iniquity and guilt by eating their holy things, for I am the Lord who sanctifies them. Interesting principle he makes with the daughter, isn't it? That if she goes and she marries, she becomes someone else. She's not of your family, she's of that family now. And if for some reason she is no longer married, whether widowed or divorced, and has no child, she can return. What if she has a child? Why can't she return? What do y'all think? You got it right. Her bloodline is different. What do you do if you take a woman who has a child, who is the daughter of the priest, and bring her back in? Is this child of the priesthood or not? Well, no. It's got to be a no. In fact, that's what he's talking about when he says at the end of verse 13 that she may return and eat of her father's food, yet no layperson shall eat of it. They're getting at that very point in probably ways that made a whole lot more sense to them than it does to us, because it seems out of place, but that's what they're getting at. You can't bring a lay family back in and then suddenly make it okay. Like, it doesn't work that way. Only if she comes back in her entirety, as in her youth, to rejoin that family until either she marries again or she lives the rest of her life in her father's house. Any thoughts on that one before we get 17 through, 25-ish? Who is considered a lay person? Anybody who's not a priest under this context. Any other tribe. And for much of this context, I would even include Levi. That there's many things they are not allowed to have. This is specifically for the priests. It should be called Pt.6, but it's called Leviticus. Yeah. All right, Lee.
She was married to a priest, and she has to go back to her father's family with her child. She can't, right?
She's not allowed to eat of anything holy. She could return, but even though she's with the priest, she can't. Yeah. Yep. And the answer is because there's a corruption. Like, that's it. That's as simple as it needs to be. It's not cut and dry. It's not 100% obvious any longer. There is a problem. And anywhere connected to priesthood, if at any point somebody steps back and says, that's a problem, done, out. It's not to come back. And so yeah, you're picking up on right down to the minutia exactly as they would have. Yeah?
Priesthood has to be a direct descendant of Aaron, right? Bloodline.
Yes. Yes. You have a comment? Okay. All right, let's read further. Verse 17. The Lord spoke to Moses and he said, "Speak to Aaron and his sons and all the people of Israel, say to them, when anyone of the house of Israel or of the sojourners in Israel presents a burnt offering as his offering, for any of their vows or freewill offerings that they offer to the Lord, if it is to be accepted for you, it shall be a male without blemish of the bulls and of the sheep or of the goats. You shall not offer anything that has a blemish, for it will not be accepted for you. When anyone comes with a peace offering, whether for a vow or a freewill, he goes again into it, can have no blemish. It can't be blind, it can't be disabled, it can't be mutilated, or have a discharge or an itch or scabs or so forth and so on. You have to present someone that is pure. However, in verse 23, he says, you may present a bull or a lamb that has a part that is too long or too short for a freewill offering, but for a vow offering it cannot be accepted. Any animal that has its testicles bruised or crushed or torn or cut, you can't offer. You shall not do it within your land, neither shall you offer as the bread of your God any such animals gotten from a foreigner, since there is a blemish in them because of their mutilation, they shall not be accepted for you." So, just general principles on what does it mean to offer an unblemished animal to God. We've talked about much of this, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But does anybody have any comments that they wish to make? Okay. 26. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, when an ox or a sheep or a goat is born, it shall remain 7 days with its mother, and from the 8th day on it shall be acceptable as a food offering. Why are we going into this? What does it mean that it has to be a year old? What does it mean that it has to be a lamb? What does it mean? That's why we're going into this. So what's the principle? Has to be over 8 days old. Well, it has to be 8 days old. 7 days it stays with its mom. On the 8th day, it can be acceptable as a food offering. So it can count as lamb. It can count as young at that point. You can also see in verse 28, you shall not kill an ox or a sheep and her young in 1 day. This may be a direct point right at Canaanites, because it was pretty common for fertility god rituals for you to kill the mother and the child in the same day, because it brings more fertility and more offspring into the ritual. It may be. It may also just be God being kind. Like, just think about that image right there. I'm not going to kill the parent and the child on the same day. Like, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to accept that. When you sacrifice the sacrifice of thanksgiving to the Lord, you shall sacrifice it so that you may be accepted. It shall be eaten on the same day. You shall leave none of it until morning. I am the Lord. So you shall keep my commandments and do them. I am the Lord. You shall not profane my holy name, that I may be sanctified among the people of Israel. I am the Lord who sanctifies you, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord. You shall not profane my holy name. I am sanctified, and so are you. So we go back to my title, right? This is God's definition of holiness. This is what he's talking about with the priesthood. When he says you are set apart and you are separate, I have a whole set of rules for you that don't apply to somebody from Judah. They only apply to you. I have a whole set of rules for the kind of animals that you're to offer, because I am making a point. You have to be separate. The animals you choose for me have to be separate. How you behave has to be separate. You're not like everybody. You're different. You're holy. Any thoughts on 22? When you sacrifice the sacrifice of thanksgiving to the Lord, you shall eat it so that you may be accepted. What's the question? It would be a peace offering. Probably also a sin offering would qualify under this definition. Because really it just says, when you offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving, which we know a peace offering is called that at one point, you have to eat it under certain regulations. Yeah. Anything else? Let's talk about 23. I'm excited for 23. There's a lot of symbolism in 23, a lot of action going on, even though from our perspective we're just reading. But lots going on. This is an incredibly important chapter to all of Israel, because this is their feasts. This is when you, the Benjamite, get to come and participate in a ritual with God. Not just, okay, I went to the temple and I offered a sacrifice. No, these are huge events. Huge events. These are plan your life months in advance events, because you spent hundreds of dollars on a ticket. You're going to make sure that you're not sick even, because there's no refund. Like, you are planning this out so that your life is ready for these events. Even though we know God does actually provide sick leave for this. And some of them you can do a little bit later if you were ill the first time or traveled too far, things like that. So God's kinder than our capitalist United States when it comes to that. So what are the feasts? Verse 1, the Lord says to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel, say to them, these are the appointed feasts of the Lord, that you may proclaim as a holy convocation. They are my appointed feast. Let's talk about some definitions. What does it mean when it says feast? Now, when you and I say feast, we immediately start thinking of like Thanksgiving, right? We think of lots of food. We think of variety of food. That's not what it means. It has to do with going a long distance to get somewhere. I don't know why in English we call it feast, because that's not the definition of the word feast. Well, I'm just going to be honest. Pilgrimage is a better word that matches the Hebrew idea. Because when we talk about these feasts, these are things you have to travel for. You can't just stay at home and have, the Day of Atonement. That doesn't work. Like, you got to move somewhere. In Islam, they have a pilgrimage they call going to Mecca or just Mecca. That's the same idea. It's the same concept, root of this, that you have to go from your place to some place because otherwise God is angry at you. Same idea. So that's a feast. ESV also uses the words holy convocation. Anybody ever used convocation in your daily life? Yeah, I Googled it because it's not a word I ever use. It means get together. Wouldn't it be a much better Leviticus if it's just like, it's the holy get together? Because that's all it is. So you travel a long way because it's a feast. It's a holy convocation, which means at the end of it, you got to be with people. You can't get to the end of your journey and be alone. You did it wrong. So you're together, and you traveled. Any comments or thoughts on the first two verses? Yeah.
It says sacred assembly.
Yes. Yeah. Sacred assembly. That's exactly right. I like get together. None of them use get together. I just like it. Verse 3. 6 days shall work be done. On the seventh is the Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all of your dwelling places. How many of you thought that the very first feast that we're going to talk about is the regular seventh day of the week? Like that's not on our mind. I certainly wouldn't have expected it. Yet that is the very first thing that God brings up when he says, these are my holy things. These are my holy events on your calendar. The first thing he says is every single week you got one. Notice what he describes it as. 6 days work shall be done. On the seventh it is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. What does that hint to you? That what were they supposed to do on the Sabbath? Get together. This is not a stay at home and put your feet up. This is a get together. Now, it's not a feast. I don't see the word feast in there. So you don't got to go a long distance traveling. It's not a pilgrimage. Because after all, that doesn't work, right? If you got to travel to Jerusalem, but you live in Zebulun, like that's all you do is go to Jerusalem and go back home, and you've got like 4 hours, and then you're going back to Jerusalem. Like that doesn't work. But you are getting together with people. And you're doing something. Probably you're studying. This is where the idea of the, what's the word in the New Testament? Their version of church. What is it? Synagogue. There it is. That's where the idea of the synagogue comes from. You come, you get together on the Sabbath day to study. It's really very biblical. The idea of the rabbi is not as biblical. It should have been a Levite, but you do what you do. Any comments on the Sabbath day? Okay, so this is the first one. Every single week you've got a holy convocation. Every single week you've got to get ready for this because you're not working on that day, so prepare ahead. In the wandering years, they had to make sure to make enough food the day before, right? The second feast in verse 4. So really the first feast we're talking about, the second holy convocation. These are the appointed feasts of the Lord, the holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at the time appointed to them. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight, is the Lord's what? What is this feast? Passover. One of the most popular and famous of all of the Jewish feasts. Popularized because Christ, right? He died around it, right? Does the Lord's Supper then. Like, it's a big important thing. So, this is the Passover. What was the purpose of the Passover? Like, what are they supposed to be reminded of? Egypt. And specifically, that God didn't kill you. Blood on the doorposts and the mantle. Yep. That God passed over. You guys have heard that, right? I'm grateful for this English word. That one helps me. So God didn't kill you on this day. So you're going to remember it every single year. It takes place on the 15th day of the same month as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So the 15th day of the first month. This is the beginning of your calendar year. The beginning of the feasts for the year. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread during the Feast of Unleavened Bread that takes place immediately following it. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall not do any work, but you shall present a food offering to the Lord for 7 days. On the seventh day is a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. Okay, feast number 1 is the Passover. They get together. They have the Passover the way that Exodus describes it, with the animal in the way that it's supposed to, with the bitter herbs in the way it's supposed to, and the unleavened bread in the way it's supposed to, with themselves girded to leave, dressed to leave, right? Your staff in your hand. Remember all that? That's the way they celebrate this Passover, because it is reminding them, God didn't kill you, and I took you out of slavery. That's what Feast of Unleavened Bread is then going to remind you. Because what did they eat when they left Egypt? All of the unleavened bread that they prepared ahead of time that God told them to. So that's their purpose. That's what they're supposed to be doing. Any comments on Passover or Feast of Unleavened Bread? So this is how you begin your calendar year. So important points I want you to remember. Passover is about God didn't kill you. He killed something else instead. Okay? So then it was Egypt and the firstborns of Egypt. So remember, when we talk about this as a symbol for us, we have a Passover. The New Testament talks about it in a variety of places. It talks about Christ being our Passover. It's literally, God didn't kill us. He killed someone else instead. Then we have the unleavened bread. You walk with God. That's it. You don't eat fancy. You don't have a ton of stuff going on beyond the first day and the last day. You get together with God and the rest of the Jews. Like, that's it. So you've got God didn't kill you and now you're with him. That's the two. He's brought you out of slavery. Any thoughts before we get into verse 9 and following? I think it depends on how you read it, and it depends on which Jewish scholar you read. Some of them said day one of it is Passover day. Some of them said day one of it is the day after Passover day. The way I see it is it seems to be Passover day is a Sabbath, and then you've got the beginning of the next week all the way to the first day of the next week. That's the way I read it. Yeah. Technically 8 days, because the 8th day is a holy convocation again. Yeah. All right, Feast of First Fruits, verse 9. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you and reap its harvest, you shall bring the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. He shall wave the sheaf before the Lord so that you may be accepted. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. On the day when you wave the sheaf, you shall bring a male lamb a year old without blemish as a burnt offering to the Lord. And the grain offering with it shall be 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, a food offering to the Lord with a pleasing aroma. And the drink offering with it shall be of wine, 1/4 of a hin. You shall eat neither bread nor grain, parched or fresh, until this same day, until you have brought the offering of your God. It is a statute forever throughout your generations in all of your dwellings." When were they to start this particular feast? Well, you get a time for it. Once they're in the land. Simply put, they're wandering in the wilderness. Nobody's growing anything. How do you celebrate a harvest that didn't occur? Like, it just can't. Once you're in the land, this one has to happen. When does this one happen as far as calendar time period? Right after Passover. Probably the first day of unleavened bread. I say probably just because it doesn't say it clearly, and me being me, I can make a really strong argument that it's not on that day, but I can make a really strong argument that it is too. So my reasoning is, you've got this one talking about, he shall wave it in verse 11. Wave it before the Lord, so on that day you may be accepted. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. So, by context, I think it works. But also down in verse 15, in order to know when the Feast of Weeks starts, you start counting on the day that you wave it. Well, the Feast of Weeks happens 7 full weeks later. We call it Pentecost, thanks to the New Testament. Well, if you start counting it a whole week late, then it's a week late. And so it seems like the first fruits is the first day of unleavened bread, the day right after Passover. So that's my reasoning. If you need me to say it again, I'll say it afterwards, because I'm going to move on. Any comments or thoughts? Okay. First fruits is a fun one. On this day, you bring the first of your harvest. You need to bring a whole sheaf, and you need to bring it to the priest, and the priest waves it. Meaning, more than likely, you get it back. They may take part of it and burn it. Wave offerings are a little bit ambiguous, and sometimes it seems like they did, and sometimes it seems like they didn't. We know they do of the grain and of the drink offerings. They're going to take some of it and put it on the altar, but the rest of it then would be given to the priest. But what happens to the sheaf is not entirely clear, so I'm going to leave it at that. It is so that you are accepted. This is not a voluntary, I'm just going to do it because I need to do it. Well, this year wasn't a great harvest, so I'm not gonna. No. You do it or you're not accepted for the rest of the year. This is important. This is just as holy as Passover, just as holy as unleavened bread. Don't forget it, even though it's sandwiched right there in the middle of all of that. It's also super interesting. What are you bringing as your offering? You bring a certain kind of animal. What kind is it? A lamb. You bring a certain kind of food. What's that? Fine flour mixed with oil. And you bring a certain kind of drink. Wine. So on this day, a lamb is offered to God, and you eat bread that doesn't have leaven and drink fruit of the vine. You guys see where I went with that? Yeah, I see the head nods. Isn't that cool? A feast that in the New Testament we talk about 0% of the time. Because Passover and unleavened bread is so exciting. And yet this is the one that is quite literally what we do every single Lord's Day. Like that's literally what it is. We have a lamb offering that is a burnt offering, which means an I love God offering, which means you don't get anything from it. It just is. The offering of Jesus just is with the Lord's Supper. Isn't that what we talk about? When Paul says you get together and you remember his death, that's it. We don't come to the Lord's Supper and ask for forgiveness. That's not its purpose. It's to remember. It's a burnt offering. And then we eat of unleavened bread. And then we drink of the fruit of the vine. Because this is the beginning of the harvest. This is the first fruits. We are the firstborn of God. Any comments? Yeah?
Who all's drinking here? Because my cross references and stuff in my study Bible says that this is approximately a gallon of wine. I hope it's not just one.
It would have come from the family. Yeah.
Everybody, right?
Yeah.
But I guess it depends on how many people you've got.
Yeah. And probably they drink more wine with it. Just because it's only a gallon, they're probably going to have more. Yeah.
Some scholars say a quart. Some scholars say a quart.
Yeah. It's hard to know. Their measuring was so different than us. It depends on which point of history you want to stop and say. So you're going to get a little bit of a different measurement. But the point is it's a lot because you're actually offering something. So you can't just say, I squeezed a few grapes, I got a little bit of a handful of liquid. That's not enough. You got to have a harvest. You have to have a first fruit. Okay. Any comments before we talk about the Feast of Weeks? Okay. Feast of Weeks starts off in verse 15. You shall count 7 full weeks from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering. See, there's my reasoning again. You shall count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall present a grain offering of new grain to the Lord. You shall bring from your dwelling places 2 loaves of bread to be waved, made of 2/10 of an ephah. They shall be of fine flour. They shall be baked with leaven, as first fruits to the Lord. With leaven. I'm going to reiterate that before I read on. And you shall present with the bread 7 lambs a year old without blemish, and 1 bull from the herd and 2 rams. They shall be a burnt offering to the Lord with their grain offering and their drink offerings, a food offering with the pleasing aroma to the Lord. You shall offer 1 male goat for a sin offering and 2 male lambs a year old as a sacrifice of peace offerings. The priest shall wave them with the bread of the first fruits as a wave offering before the Lord. with the 2 lambs. They shall be holy to the Lord for the priest, and you shall make a proclamation on the same day. You shall hold a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. It is a statute forever in all of your dwelling places throughout your generations. Okay. 7 full weeks and a day later, Pentecost, 50 days, right? 50 days after Passover. That's the point we're talking. And we remember this as Day of Pentecost, Acts chapter 2, right? They stand up, everybody's there, they give a message. So that's what we're talking about, same day. For the Jews, the importance of it is that you present a grain offering of new grain to the Lord. This is a harvest one again. A lot of them are harvest, right? First fruits, the very beginning of a harvest, back there 50 days earlier. Now, you should have a fairly substantial one. So we're pre-harvesting and post-harvesting here. So you're rejoicing still, because a whole bunch of harvest is here. I'm just going to stop and stand over here to the side. And how many people were baptized on the day of Pentecost? Yeah, 3,000. Does that sound like a whole bunch of harvest? Next chapters talk about, what, 5,000, and then a whole bunch of people. And can you see it's trying to mirror again? Today is the day of a big harvest. Okay, let's go back to it. You're to bring in from your dwelling places. So this is an individual trying to bring it in. So it could be at the main family level, so the patriarch bringing in. It could be, if you're wealthy enough, on your own family level. You're bringing in 2 loaves of bread to be waved. You're bringing in as well let's talk about those loaves. They need to be made of fine flour, and they are made with leaven. I thought leaven was evil, and you couldn't use leaven. What's the importance of using leaven here and not elsewhere? What's the symbol? What do you think? What does leaven do to bread? Makes it rise. It gets really big, right? So if an unleavened bread of equal amount of material makes a little loaf, a leavened one should make a larger loaf, yes? It's about abundance. That's what we're talking about. But we're also talking about safety here. You have had time to allow the bread to rise. You're not rushing. You're not hurrying. Passover is about hurrying. Unleavened bread, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is about hurrying. This one's not. You've arrived. Rest. Relax. It's here now. So think about that with the day of Pentecost. That is the day that we can say our understanding, our kingdom begins. Certainly the day that the church has its roots. The great assembly of Christians at that point. They're not called Christians, disciples at that point. That's it. Before then, it has a king and no one in it. But now you're here. It has a firm foundation in the form of 12 individuals who can stand up and do things no one else can do. And then a whole bunch of people are now Christians, are now followers of Christ. It's anchored. You can rest now. Really rapidly, we're up to 10,000 Christians in a matter of a couple of chapters. Take a breath. You made it. It expands. Doesn't Jesus have a whole bunch of parables that talk about the same thing? What is the kingdom of heaven like? It's like a little leaven. Leaven's everything. It's like a little mustard seed, and it grows and fills the whole earth. Little expand. Any comments anybody has?
Be relatively rich to do all of it because of the things that you had to bring to sacrifice. So that they were thus taught to work to provide not only for themselves but for the Lord.
Yeah. Which goes back to the promise of God. You will have enough. You will be blessed. But it may also have been on patriarchal level. So you are the eldest male. Everyone under your line is fits. And so the family brings.
We're talking about these different feasts back to back to back. Jesus was crucified during Passover.
Mm-hmm.
He was buried during the Feast of Planting, and he was raised on the Feast of First Fruits. He was the first fruit.
Yeah.
And God had all that planned before the beginning of time.
Yeah. and told us all about it right here in Leviticus, a forgotten book right up there with Song of Solomon. Yeah, thank you. All right, let's get a little more into Feast of Weeks. You also are to bring a whole bunch of animals. Verse 18, it talks about 7 lambs that are a year old without blemish, a bull from the herd, and 2 rams. All of them are burnt offerings. I love God offerings. This is an exciting time. We're just excited. That's what those are for. But you also have to bring in a male goat for a sin offering and 2 male lambs as peace offerings. So we're also going to offer one as a removal of uncleanness. Not necessarily because you did anything wrong. Remember, that's a sin offering. Could be unintentional, but a sin offering is going to bring you back in the right relationship with God. And then 2 peace offerings because we want this relationship to continue. Remember, that one was the meal with God. You eat, the priests eat, and God himself eats. You've all sat at the same table together. You shall make a proclamation down there in verse 21. This is a holy convocation. Get together. Don't be apart. This is holy. This is why in the New Testament people are still there from Passover. They didn't go home. Because what's the point of going home? You got to come right back. Any comments anybody has? Okay. All right. Feast of Trumpets. Well, we'll get verse 22. Verse 22 is like an add-in here. You shall not reap the harvest of your land. You shall not reap your field right up to its edge. Nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. Don't reap to the corners just to fulfill. Don't reap to the corners because God has given it to you either. You leave them some portions. So, Feast of Trumpets. The Lord spoke to Moses and he said, speak to the people of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you shall observe a day of solemn rest, a memorial proclaimed with blast of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. You shall present, and you shall present a food offering to the Lord. Doesn't talk about the food offering here. The purpose of this one is to bring it into the context. On the 7th month, something huge is going to happen. It's the Day of Atonement. We're going to talk about it in a moment. And then it's the Feast of Booths. Huge. And so we're going to start the month off with trumpets so that everybody in all of the land of Israel hears these trumpets and realizes this is the month. Get yourself in order, because a few days from now, on the 10th day, you got to be doing something. And you've got to have enough left to be able to do the next one that starts 5 days later and lasts for 7. You got to get your things in order to take your family of 35 down there to Jerusalem in order to perform the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Booths. Get prepared. And so that's what this one is about. You can't miss it. Everybody stopped working. Everybody gets together as a holy convocation wherever you are. You can't miss the day. Like, nobody's like, oh, I was out in the field, I didn't know. No, you heard the blast, and every single person in the field suddenly was walking in. Like, you know this is going on. This is the time to get ready. Something huge is going to happen.
Okay, this sounds like a one day.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So it's probably not in Jerusalem.
Right. It's wherever they are.
An altar
Yep.
located.
Not something we talk about very often, is it? Probably a burnt offering, because that one they were allowed to do without priest once they're in the land. Yeah. The others, you need a priest. It's hard to do a peace offering where a priest is supposed to eat it and he's not there. Yeah. Yeah, that's as far as I want to go into that. All right, so many thoughts. Okay, does anybody have any thoughts before we get a little bit of Day of Atonement in? Yes. Everybody's getting together for Day of Atonement. Verse 26, the Lord says to Moses, now on the 10th day of the 7th month is the Day of Atonement. It shall be for you a time of holy convocation, and you shall afflict yourselves and present a food offering to the Lord. This is huge. You are humbling yourself. You're afflicting yourself. It may mean fasting on this day. This is a huge day. Everyone is together. Everyone notices, and you're feeding God. Food offering to God, not for you. You shall not do any work on that day, for it is the Day of Atonement to make atonement for you before the Lord your God. All of the year, this is the day. when God says, hey, I'm either going to kill all of you, we're early again, or I'm going to not. Those are our differences. And we're going to have to stop there because they ring the buzzer, and I don't want to go too far into it anymore. But we'll pick up with verse 26, and we will do chapter 16 because it is the actual act of the Day of Atonement that Aaron has to do. Also, take a look at chapter 25. We'll get into that. Let me see here. I'll tell you what page of your questions we're doing. So 25 is on page 11, and then we'll do page 12, provisions for the tabernacle, next time. We'll be dismissed.
To wait right down.